folks, I'm Tom Vasel, and today we're going to be taking a look at some games that won the Spiel des Jahres. Now, the Spiel des Jahres is an award that was created in 1978 in Germany to promote board gaming. So it is almost 40 years old, and there have been many different games that have won the Spiel des Jahres. The Spiel des Jahres is typically a family-style game, a game that families can play. It was kind of made for that purpose. It's voted on by a jury of judges who pretty much that's what they do over the course of a year, is they play all these different games. The judges from Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and then they get together and vote. They have a list of nominees, which has changed in number. It is currently 3 nominees, but it's been 5 and other numbers as time has gone by. There's actually several awards. There is the Spiel des Jahres, there is the Kenner Spiel des Jahres, which is the advanced strategy game, and there's a children's game of the year. However, some of these awards are new. The Kenner Spiel came out in 2011, I believe, and the children one has been out. And there's also been the most beautiful game. Sometimes they give out special awards. For the purposes of today, we're just going to be concentrating on the Spiel des Jahres. And I'm going to tell you what I think were the 10 best Spiel des Jahres winners. Now, I'm not looking at these per se as in my favorite games that came out from Spiel des Jahres. I'm thinking, hey, this is where I think they got it right. And they really got it right to the point where, wow, they gave a game a boost that deserved to get a boost. So here we go. Number 10 in 1996 is El Grande. Now this one I really kind of struggled with putting on the list because I love El Grande. It's one of my favorite games. However, El Grande is maybe a smidgen too complex for what the Spiel des Jahres is doing, where they're trying to promote games to families. But it is not that difficult, especially if you take the expansion out, just play with the straight basic game. And it did introduce area control, and it also came out during a time where they were awarding to a little bit more complex games, although one of those games might show up on my worst games list. But I think this game did break some ground. This area control, where you try to control different regions on the board, it's not new to El Grande, but El Grande was the first one to make it popular, and many, many, many games owe what they do to this one. Number 9 is from 1983, and that is Scotland Yard. Now, Scotland Yard is one of the few games that made it to America long before what I call the Euro invasion, which came around 95, 96, where many games started coming over from Germany. Scotland Yard came over earlier than that, and it is a game that when you compare it side by side, the games where you rolled dice and moved, here one person was moving and hiding, and the other players were trying to capture him. There are several games like that out now, but at the time, it was just an amazing thing and so easy for people to get into the theme. It wasn't based on any intellectual property, just a straight up fun theme. Number 8 from 1999 is Tikal. Now, Tikal, which is being reprinted soon, hopefully, was a game that kind of did this action point allowance, where you had a certain number of action points and helped. At the time, many of the Euro games were kind of like maybe a little bit themeless, but Tikal had this strong exploring into the jungle and finding temples theme to it, had some great components back when many of the components for these games weren't very good, and this one just kind of hit a chord with many people. It's part of what we call the Mask trilogy that also includes Java and Mexica, but Tikal is probably the most accessible of those games and still does well today. Number 7 came out in 2003, and that's Alhambra. Now this is at first blush, you're like, oh, another tile-laying game like the very popular Carcassonne. But Alhambra was something very different. Alhambra introduced some things that didn't make a whole lot of sense thematically. 4 different currencies, you can spend them. But it had this really cool concept where if you spent the exact amount that something cost, you could take another tile. It came out with oodles of expansions that make the game a lot of fun, or you know, some are better than others. I think there's at least 25 to 30 mini expansions that are out for this game. It was rethemed later on as New York, but the fact is none of that's really necessary. The base game itself was just a very simple concept where you were buying tiles, putting those tiles down, and then scoring points for the different types of tiles that you had. An easy concept and one that a lot of people enjoyed. Number 6 was in 2007, and that's Zularetto. Zooloretto is a game about building a zoo, and I've always been kind of mind-boggled that more games don't take this theme, because a zoo is something that is just, you know, hey, we're building a zoo, yay! People like to go to zoos, they like to visit zoos. The idea of having groups of zebras and elephants and gorillas is a fun one, and Zooloretto took it for a very simple concept and built on a previous game called Coloretto, which was a fun little card game, took that concept and expanded it just enough to take a fun family game that had a great theme, cool components, and still was very simple and accessible to families. Number 5 is 1994. This was just before the cusp of what I call the Euro invasion, and that was Manhattan. Now, Andres Seyfarth is probably best well known for Puerto Rico, which came out and is just as one of the most popular board games ever designed. But Manhattan is a really impressive game, just its sheer simplicity. Again, this is a theme that people like, building skyscrapers. All right. And this game came with piles of plastic skyscrapers, and you're trying to have the most skyscrapers in cities, have the most skyscrapers, period, and you even get points for having the tallest skyscrapers. You're placing on top of other people with a very simple system. You play a card, and you pick which city you're going to play that card into. That's pretty much it, and the game just has this easily accessible feature to it. I'm kind of a little surprised that it's currently out of print, but within 5 years you'll see someone probably publishing this one again, because it is that good of a game. Now we're at the 4 big ones. These 4 games, I think, were transformative games where they made a huge difference. The first one, number 4, came out in 1993. You'll notice that the mid-90s here was a pretty strong period for games for the Spiel des Jahres. And that is Call My Bluff, or Liar's Dice. Now, this was Richard Borg taking essentially a sort of a public domain game. People were already kind of playing variants of this, but it gave the game rules, and Liar's Dice has just been constantly in print ever since, whether it's called Perudo or Liar's Dice. It would even made the movies in the Pirates of the Caribbean too. And this whole concept of rolling dice and then lying to other people is very simple. There's a lot of games where you're trying to bluff other people, but this allowed you to do it with dice, gave everyone a chance to shake cups. I know this game is still being played consistently everywhere, and this was just a good, solid game to win the award. The big 3, number 3, 2001. These are not really going to come as a surprise to most people, I think, and that is Carcassonne. I remember in 2001 reading a magazine about Carcassonne, and when I first read it, like, you're putting tiles down, and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. You're putting tiles down and making like a puzzle, but it's also a game? See, we don't think about that nowadays, but there's this thing that people like to build puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, and put them out. Well, Carcassonne isn't necessarily a jigsaw puzzle, but it has that same kind of feel as you. Like, wow, this goes here, and this builds this city. And the concept of then putting these meeples, which has become a term vastly used in board gaming, putting them down and building this big map has really taken off. Carcassonne was one of the most successful Spiel des Jahres. It is still being reprinted, rethemed, expansions up the wazoo. There's that, even a catapult expansion, and people make fun of that. But the fact is that Carcassonne was so big and so popular that it could handle weird, oddball expansions like that. And it just was they just redesigned it and re-released it a few years ago, still going strong. Number 2 in 2004 is Ticket to Ride. This is one of those games that the very first time I played it, I said, this is going to win the Spiel des Jahres. This is one of the few years when they announced the nominees for Spiel des Jahres. It was like, why is anything else even nominated? Because I knew Ticket to Ride was going to win. It is that strong of a game. Yes, in essence, it takes the concepts of Rummy and applies them to a board game, but you are just putting out these trains. Now, Alan Moon had been designing all sorts of games with various degrees of success, and he was able to take ideas from those and streamline them to almost perfection. Ticket to Ride does well with 2 players, 3, 4, and 5. It's one of the few games that works well with the whole realm of players. They are constantly releasing new maps and new versions of it. The iOS or the Android's computer version of it has been a smash success. This game has sold, I believe, almost 4 million copies. It is an unparalleled smash hit other than number 1, and just has done that well in the hobby. It kind of, you see it everywhere at Target and such. Just, this was an easy number 2. Well, okay. Surprising no one, at number 1, 1995, Catan, or as it was called in 1995, The Settlers of Catan. I credit 2 games with changing gaming forever. One is Magic the Gathering, which came out in 1994. The other is Settlers of Catan, and those 2 games changed gaming into something that was played occasionally to something that is now a hobby that supports people like me and everything else. I personally owe Settlers of Catan. If you're playing games right now, you owe Catan. Now, it's kind of the cool thing to do today to be like, I don't really like Catan. And indeed, many people have moved past it, but there is no denying that this giant of gaming, this thing that came in to the point where the sale of this game, which just happened a month or so ago, the sale of this game, which is one game, and over 20 years after the game came out, was a huge piece of news, a huge amount of money, because the empire that Catan has spawned is that big. Not just Settlers of Catan, but there's a 2-player versions. There's many expansions for Catan. There was a space version. There was a Star Trek theme version. There were various historical ones. There are maps and scenarios. There are books. There was even talk of a movie coming from this. This game just, even today I'll meet people and they'll say, well, have you heard of Settlers of Catan? It's hit the mainstream. Very few of hobby games or even Spiel des Jahres games hit the mainstream like Catan has. And therefore, it is the best Spiel des Jahres winner. Well, those are my picks for the best 10. Come back and I'll be telling you what I think the worst 10 choices were. I will say overall, I think the judges mostly get it right. They do a good job at picking these games. You'll notice that the newest one on my list is 2007, which is almost 10 years ago. Part of that is I think many of the recent picks have been good, but also it's partly maybe a little too early to tell. There's a few games in recent years, like Quirkle almost made my list because I think that game has long legs. Hanabi might possibly. I know that one's been selling really well, but we'll have to wait and see. Maybe in another decade I'll come back and revisit this and see if 10 years has changed my opinions on it. What do you think? What do you think are the most potent, the most important choices, the winners of the Spiel des Jahres? Let me know below in the comments. Until next time, I'm Tom Vasel, and you've been watching The Dice Tower.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.